I was born and raised in a small town in Southern Oregon, and I was a good kid in school. I grew up in a normal middle-class family. I got great grades, I was really active in sports, and I even graduated a year early. I was accepted into Oregon State University, and I had my dorm room already assigned, and I was really excited to move up to Corvallis. But that summer I got pregnant by my boyfriend, and I had to make a real tough decision whether I was going to keep my baby and unenroll from university or get an abortion and keep it all a secret. And that was a really tough summer for me. After I had the baby, I had some friends that had gone up to U of O to go to college, and they had an extra room in one of their apartments. It was at that time that I met a boy or a guy who pretended to take interest in me. I really thought he liked me, and we got along really well. He was really funny and charming, and he had a nice car, and he always picked up the tab. He had nice clothes. He told me he was a record producer, that he had a band up in Portland, and that's why he frequently went out of town. There's a saying that says when you take a child by the hand, you take the mother by the heart. And I really think that's what happened for me, because I had this new little girl and this man who showed this desperate attention towards her, like he wanted to really help make this family that I really wanted for my daughter. And he invited me to move in with him after about 6 months of dating, and I was really excited. And I brought him down to Southern Oregon to meet my family, and everything seemed fine until we arrived in Las Vegas. He said we were moving there because that was the entertainment capital of the world, and being a record producer and having a band, that's where they were going to get the most gigs and the most jobs, and that's where his job was leading him. So I desperately wanted to go with him, to be with him, and to start this family that he promised me. He pulled up to an escort service, and he said, "This is how it works in Vegas. I've spent a lot of money to get you here. I put first and last on an apartment. I filled your fridge up with food, and you're gonna need to earn that money back." And I felt trapped. I felt like, how am I gonna get out of this? And you didn't know if you were gonna live or die. You didn't know what he was gonna do or what he was capable of, and so it was really scary. I can remember just running through the casino thinking, like, these people don't even have a clue what's going on. They're just, cha-ching, cha-ching, Las Vegas, yay! And they're doing all this stuff, and I'm running for my life. I'm running from a man that has forced me into doing things that I didn't want to do. When you have a trafficker that's waiting at home with your child and says, if you don't bring home $1,500, you're going to find your daughter out on the corner, I think I was probably more frightened to go home than I was to be in the room. Because if you got robbed, it was your fault for being stupid. If you got raped, it was your fault for not watching your back. Anything that happened to you was typically your fault, and you incurred more punishment for allowing those things to happen to you. So it made you always walk in fear of your trafficker.
Selling girls. It's hard to think about, it's hard to imagine. But the truth is, it is happening right here in America. Predators targeting vulnerable girls and women, sometimes as young as 11. They lure them in online and off, flattering them with compliments, praise. You're pretty, you should model. They learn the victim's vulnerabilities. They gain psychological control. They isolate them. And then they threaten them with violence against the girls or their families if they do not do as instructed. The girls describe feeling trapped, scared. And the next thing they know, they are being marketed for sex. And who buys them? It could be your neighbor, your doctor, your friend. All a person has to do is log on to the internet, find an ad, and click and buy. You will hear from one man who did it, a suburban husband and father who says it's just that simple. It's easy to say, not my child, not my sister, not my husband. But the next hour could change how you feel.
I had met him at a party. He was the kind of guy that everybody in the room wanted to be his friend, and all the girls wanted to date him. We dated for 6 months, and things got serious very quickly. So he proposed the idea of moving to Vegas, and he said, but I can't ask you and the baby to move to Vegas because this isn't where families live. And I thought, oh, he thinks we're a family. I'll come. He had gotten us an apartment, and he told me that night we had some sleeping bags, I think. We weren't even completely like unpacked or anything, and he said, get dressed up, I want to take you out on the town. And he drove me to a dead-end street instead of to a nightclub. And so he was like, well, this building is an escort service, and you're going to need to sign up. And I thought, escort? That sounds like prostitution. This isn't what I signed up for. This wasn't my plan. And that's when he slapped me across the face. And he said, you're going to go inside and you're going to get my money back. And I knocked on the door, and he was an attractive young man. I remember him opening his wallet and counting out like a little over 300 bucks. And like pulled me on top of him, and I had on a dress, so he had pulled my underwear to the side. And then I thought, how did I get here? Like, how did I get to that moment where it's like gradual, and then like suddenly this boundary that you swore you'd never cross, you're crossing, and before you can like backtrack, it's over.
Rebecca Bender, who is now a nationally recognized anti-trafficking advocate, joins us here. Rebecca, welcome to you.
Thanks.
So this guy you'd been dating him for 6 months. He met your family. Had there been any indications earlier on that he was controlling, that he was manipulating?
I mean, my family always thought something was not right, but I don't think very many American families think human trafficking. They thought, is he a drug dealer? Something's off. But I was so in love that it was hard to convince me otherwise.
How did he get you to go into that hotel room for the first night with another man?
Well, we went to a townhouse. It was a local call. We had left my daughter at home with his brother. And so immediately when he slapped me across the face, my first response was, I don't know where my baby is. I don't know my address by heart. I just got to Las Vegas from this tiny town in Oregon. I didn't know the city. And so I complied. I was afraid. And I just wanted to get back to my baby. And I just wanted the night to be over. I wanted to go back to being happy and in love and hopeful. And that's when I just started crying. I thought, this isn't what I thought. This is complete fraud and deceit to lure me away from my support system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you know, there'll be some people out there who will say, okay, the first night you were afraid for your daughter. How was there ever a second night? Why didn't you separate from him? Why didn't you hitchhike, get out, do anything?
Right, a lot of people think that. Well, it's the same reasons why women in domestic violence don't run. It's the same reason why there's cult-like behavior. I mean, they're very good at brainwashing and manipulation, and they make you feel like there's this dangling carrot that you're going to reach and that it's going to be over soon. One more week, one more day, one more month. And so you keep hoping that the end comes, and by the time a few weeks, month go by, you're pretty brainwashed. I didn't even realize I was being trafficked. Mm-hmm. I thought that I was in domestic violence and my boyfriend was pressuring me to make money in escorting. But I envisioned human trafficking, I think, like most Americans, that it's kidnapped children in other countries, right, locked in rooms. I didn't realize what it looked like in a first world domestic setting. And that's why we are really geared to train Americans today on how to identify human trafficking and how to respond in their own town. Mm-hmm. Because there's many ways that it can look, and if we only envision kidnapping, we're gonna miss it when it's right in front of us.
What is the, I mean, now that you're an advocate, you got yourself out, you got yourself away from him, what is the number one thing you feel like people need to know?
I feel like people need to know that human trafficking is not what they saw in the movie Taken. That it's
That's what everybody thinks, right? That's what I thought before we got into this, too.
Right. It's way more complex. They target your vulnerabilities. They gradually expand your boundaries, increase your trust in them, and then they pressure you little by little to start moving that boundary line until you are in hot water, until you realize the water is heated up around you and you're boiling. Mm-hmm. And then you start trying to run. That's usually when people start trying to run. The separation
from your family, the increasing control, the isolation. I mean, these are all patterns of abuse, as you point out, and of trafficking, and in any case, cause for alarm.
We let ourselves think that human trafficking is only about forced prostitution, when in reality, human trafficking is embedded in our everyday lives. Let me show you what I mean. Forced prostitution accounts for 22% of human trafficking. 10% is in state-imposed forced labor. But a whopping 68% is for the purpose of creating the goods and delivering the services that most of us rely on every day in sectors like agricultural work, domestic work, and construction. That is food and care and shelter. And somehow these most essential workers are also among the world's most underpaid and exploited today. Human trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel another person's labor. And it's found in cotton fields and coltan mines and even car washes in Norway and England. It's found in US military bases in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's found in Thailand's fishing industry. That country has become the largest exporter of shrimp in the world. But what are the circumstances behind all that cheap and plentiful shrimp? Thai military were caught selling Burmese and Cambodian migrants onto fishing boats. Those fishing boats were taken out, the men put to work, and they were thrown overboard if they made the mistake of falling sick or trying to resist their treatment. Those fish were then used to feed shrimp. Shrimp were then sold to 4 major global retailers: Costco, Tesco, Walmart, and Carrefour. Human trafficking is found on a smaller scale than just that, and in places you would never even imagine. Traffickers have forced young people to drive ice cream trucks or to sing in touring boys' choirs. Trafficking has even been found in a hair braiding salon in New Jersey. The scheme in that case was incredible. The traffickers found young families who were from Ghana and Togo, and they told these families that your daughters are going to get a fine education in the United States. They then located winners of the green card lottery, and they told them, we'll help you out. We'll get you a plane ticket, we'll pay your fees. All you have to do is take this young girl with you. Say that she's your sister or your spouse. Once everyone arrived in New Jersey, the young girls were taken away and put to work for 14-hour days, 7 days a week, for 5 years. They made their traffickers nearly $4 million. This is a huge problem. So what have we done about it? We've mostly turned to the criminal justice system. But keep in mind, most victims of human trafficking are poor and marginalized. They're migrants, people of color. Sometimes they're in the sex trade. And for populations like these, the criminal justice system is too often part of the problem rather than the solution. In study after study from countries ranging from Bangladesh to the United States, between 20 to 60% of the people in the sex trade who were surveyed said that they had been raped or assaulted by the police in the past year alone. People in prostitution, including people who have been trafficked into it, regularly receive multiple convictions for prostitution. Having that criminal record makes it so much more difficult to leave poverty, leave abuse, or leave prostitution if that person so desires. Workers outside of the sex sector, if they try and resist their treatment, they risk deportation. In case after case I've studied, employers have no problem calling on law enforcement to try and threaten or deport their striking trafficked workers. If those workers run away, they risk becoming part of the great mass of undocumented workers who are also subject to the whims of law enforcement if they're caught. Law enforcement is supposed to identify victims and prosecute traffickers. But out of an estimated 21 million victims of human trafficking in the world, they have helped and identified fewer than 50,000 people. Mind you, none of what I am describing about this agricultural sector or the guest worker program is actually human trafficking. It is merely what we find legally tolerable. And I would argue this is fertile ground for exploitation, and all of this had been hidden to me before I tried to understand it. I wasn't the only person grappling with these issues. Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay, is one of the biggest anti-trafficking philanthropists in the world. And even he wound up accidentally investing nearly $10 million in the pineapple plantation cited as having the worst working conditions in that Global Horizons case. When he found out, he and his wife were shocked and horrified, and they
Katarina Rosenblatt says she was only 13 when her mother, escaping an abusive relation, took her to live in a hotel in Miami Beach. She remembers her mother worked long hours and she wandered alone.
Soon enough, there was a trafficking ring that spotted my vulnerability, being alone, having low self-esteem coming from a dysfunctional home life. You know, they spotted that. And so there was an older girl that recruited me, and she came up to me as a big sister. And so she was 19 and thin and pretty and everything I thought I wanted to be.
Kat says the girl's name was Mary, and she had a plan.
She introduced me to her pimp, and I didn't know he was a pimp. I didn't know he was a scam artist at the time. I thought he was just a nice man, like a father.
Soon after, she remembers finding herself inside a hotel room, dressed as a bride, convinced she was playing a game. She remembers the locked door and drugs on the table.
This guy who was half-dressed with a beer belly hanging out, ready to partake in his transaction. He had negotiated the price with Mary. I should say 20 years ago, the price was $550 for a virgin girl.
Kat says that time she managed to talk and plead her way out of this situation. But soon after, she says she was tricked again, this time by a friend's father.
It came in a place that you would never suspect it, and that was in my middle school. I was in 7th grade, and they blindfolded us and took us to a brothel in Broward County, from Miami to Broward. They had paid her father $40 for each of us.
She doesn't remember how long she was there for and how many men came by.
They let me know what would become of me if I ever told anyone. They told me that they knew where I lived, they knew who my teachers were, they knew what school, they knew everything about me. There was nothing I could do to protect myself. And at 14 years old, I didn't even know where to begin.
She dropped out of school and became addicted to drugs. Prostitution didn't seem so foreign anymore. She met up with a pimp. Her dreams were crushed.
I'm nothing but a drug addict and I guess a prostitute for these guys. At 15, I had given up on myself. I belonged to the street. I belonged to whoever would show me kindness or give me cocaine.
But I had two parents that were very loving, and my mom stayed at home. She was an at-home mom. So just, you know, a normal kid, lots of adventures, and played outside a lot. Just, you know, pretty normal.
So you're 15 or 14 approximately, you're living in suburban Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like, you know, sort of a normal time in your life? And, you know, take me through your first contact with this person.
Okay. It was different moving to this new place because it was just getting harder to make friends, and I was frustrated because I'd always have to leave my friends, then try and make new ones and fit in. So I wasn't real happy about this move, and the school was a lot different. It was just full of different groups of kids that I hadn't been around before, but I liked it. And I finally got a group of girls to accept me into it. And this one guy, I just kept noticing him. Like every time I turned around, he was around, and he was really cute, and he was just different than the normal boys that I had liked. But my parents were really strict and said you can't date till you're 16, and they didn't want boys calling the house. So basically, you know, that he was off limits.
I guess but you were a girl, you're 15, and you
Yeah.
like this guy.
Yeah.
You know, what happened?
After about 6 months, it took that long for him to, I guess, wear me down. He would always give me compliments, you know, and what 15-year-old girl doesn't love that, or especially from a cute guy. Just say I looked pretty, and, you know, do you need any help with your homework, things like that. And so about 6 months later, he asked me if I wanted to ride home from school one day. And none of my friends were around, nobody was there. So I jumped at the chance. I thought, that's safe enough, you know, it's not a date, my parents won't get mad. And I really honestly believed that he was going to take me home, but he didn't.
What happened?
He took me to his house and said, oh, I just have to grab something, I forgot. And, I had a weird feeling. It just didn't feel right, but I ignored it because I was 15 and I just wanted to spend some time with him. And I just believed everybody was a good person. And so he took me to his house and asked me if I wanted to come in. And I initially said no, but he convinced me and said he liked me. And once I got inside, everything changed. He offered me a soda that was laced with something, and I got drugged and then raped. Surprisingly, he even took me home right after that.
So Did you know that you had gotten raped at that point?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so you
Yeah.
were you this is just I'm trying to
I was
clarify.
dizzy and really like loopy, like really out of it.
But you knew that he's forced himself
Yep.
on you sexually.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So what happened after that? You go home and I
Yeah.
mean, do you tell your family or?
No, I didn't tell my parents. You know, and I wonder even today, like how many girls, if that happened, you know, and they were in high school, if they would rush up and tell their parents. It's different today where we have a lot of education on date rape and things like that, and back then you didn't even prosecute for that, and so I didn't say anything to my mom. I remember feeling horrible. Yeah, I was a mess, but I didn't want her to be disappointed in me. I mean, we were Irish Catholic, and I didn't want her to see me different. I just didn't want anybody to know. I just thought I'll just deal with this on my own.
But then things took a turn for the worse there. I guess that there's
Yeah.
some, tell me what happened then.
I ended up going back to school a few days later, and he came up to me with an envelope full of pictures and said, "You have to earn these back or else. We're going to show them to your dad, his boss at work." I mean, and in 1980, my dad made $100,000 a year, so I was pretty concerned that he'd get fired. He said, "We'll show them around school," and it was hard enough to make friends at that point. And then he said, "We'll show them to the priest where you're really involved at church." So for my 15-year-old mind, I thought, I have to do this. Like, I have to do. But I had no idea it was anything sexual.
So you thought earn them back. What were you thinking?
Work in their family stores that they owned, or do their homework, or clean their car. I had no idea, but it never would have crossed my mind anything that they had in store for me.
How did it get started?
They called my house. I had a private phone in my room, and I remember it was like midnight and it ringing. I thought, who in the world is calling me at midnight? And I answered it, and it was him. And he said, "They want to see you." And I'm like, "Okay, tomorrow's fine, you know." And he said, "No, now." And I was like, "Are you kidding me? It's midnight. You know, my family's home, got school in the morning." And he said, "This is not an option. You need to come now." He's like, "I'll meet you at this certain street." And I was just like, I couldn't believe it. I was in shock. And so for some reason, you know, I went and I snuck out and met his car and went to their home, the same house where he had taken me before. But this time he didn't take me to his room. He took me downstairs to a men-only area. And I met the other traffickers at that time, who were the ones I went to school with. And they proceeded to tell me the terms of the deal.
What'd they tell you?
That you will do whatever we say, whenever we say, and then we'll give you back the pictures. If you tell anybody, you're dead. We'll kill your brothers if you go to anybody, and you can't stop. Otherwise, until you've earned them back. Otherwise, there's huge penalties.
So was that first evening? Was there encounters at that point, or was that?
Yeah.
Okay. What?
Yeah,
Without getting too much detail,
Sure,
I know.
no,
What happened that evening?
And then that evening, they broke me, which is what we call it. You know, multiple rapes, and just they take you right to the brink, just so you know that those threats are real. And then they took me back home, and I went to bed. I don't think I slept all night long, and went to school the next day.
People would listen to this and find it hard to believe that there wasn't, you know, signs that you know or that you wouldn't go tell your parents, or your,
Right.
you know, confide in a friend or your brother or someone. But you know, what happened? Why not? Or you know what I mean? Can you tell me a little bit about that, or what your mindset was?
I think because we were very affluent and upper middle class, it was very taboo, you know, to share your secrets. Like you have dirty laundry in your family, and you keep it all inside. And those threats were huge. I mean, they followed us. If we were walking home from school, they would call randomly. I mean, they did so many things that let you know as a kid that they were serious, and you believed them. So there were red flags. Then my grades dropped. I was tired. But I don't think that I for once thought to tell somebody because those threats were so high. But I wished inside that somebody would notice, the little red flags I was giving off, and nobody did. Nobody came to me to say, are you okay, Teresa? Yeah, they didn't. And even if they had, I would have lied because I needed to. But I still was dreaming inside that somebody would take me away from that.
So this goes on for a period of time. Can you talk about, generally what took place during that period of time?
Meeting them several nights a week, usually in my pajamas and barefooted, and being driven to different houses, very affluent houses all around the Detroit area. There was never less than 3 men a night, probably an average of 6, and getting very little sleep, going home, and then them being there in school watching me too was very intimidating. So they were always around. So for several years, just it would get worse and worse and worse.
Tell us about, how you finally were able to, the whole experience
Sure.
that where finally you were able to get out.
Right. It really was a miracle that I got out because most don't get out of it. I went out to meet that car, and unfortunately it was some different drivers, and they kidnapped me and took me to an inner city Detroit motel where I was drugged and beaten and sold over and over again to a room full of men, and I was the only female there. And I know I passed out from that, and when I woke up I didn't know where I was, and I didn't have any identification or money or anything. And so I decided I needed to get out of there. I didn't know how I was going to get home. I didn't know what to do. And I remember trying to call my dad, and I didn't even have enough money for the payphone. I mean, I had a dime, and so I knew I was kind of far away. I was out of the area code. And, but I still didn't want, I remember him answering the phone, and I heard his voice, and it was like, you know when someone's sound asleep? And I heard his voice and I hung up. I couldn't even do it. I couldn't disappoint my dad. And it was kind of like realize it now that like they had no idea I was gone. Like I was missing, but nobody knew I was missing. And so I just thought I can't do that. But I didn't know what to do. You know, how I was going to get home. And a waitress in a little diner asked me if she could help me, and I said no, and then eventually I said yes. I need to get home, and so she called the police, and they took me home that morning, and my parents were shocked. They thought I was in bed, and I wasn't talking. I didn't tell them a thing. I needed them to believe what they were going to believe, because I needed them safe, and I didn't want anybody killed. But the police were involved by then, and they were watching the house. I still wasn't talking to the police, but they were suspicious of some stuff. So things had started to change, but they still took me during school or after school, just not at night.
People will ask, why didn't you tell the police when you had that opportunity? Was it still the fear, or?
Oh yeah, especially because I encountered the police a few hours after that, the worst thing had ever happened to me. I mean, there was probably 30 men there that night. You know, not many people could survive something like that. So I knew that if I spoke, something even worse was going to happen to me than that. So, you know, I wanted his help, but the policeman said to me, he said, I think I know who did this, and I need your help to catch him. I didn't hear him say to me, I want to help put these guys away. I want to help you get out of this. And so I was like, nope, you know, because I didn't trust him. And I went to this conference on human trafficking, but I had never known what it was called, what happened to me. Like I had searched and searched for definition, never found it. And so I went to this conference, and within 5 minutes of being there, I realized that I had found my word of what happened to me. And then I realized how many others didn't know that somebody like me could be trafficked. And I thought, if I didn't know this, you know, then how many others don't?
What do you want to get across to people?
It's that this can happen in any zip code, and it is, to any kid. I mean, it is happening all around the country, and we've just turned a blind eye to it. We've mislabeled it teen prostitution, which doesn't exist. So it's something that we really need to wake up and become aware that this is happening everywhere in the United States. It just looks different than what we've thought human trafficking looks like.
What is human trafficking?
It's the exploitation of people for commercial value. So if you exploit a person and you make them work or have sex and you're making money off them, that's human trafficking.
Who are the guys doing this? I mean, is there someone we could recognize, or is it the nice guy with the Trans Am?
It can be anybody. That's one thing that we have found, is that there is no socioeconomic consistency in it. It can be any race, any age. It can be women. We are finding a lot of women traffickers. Generally, they were trafficked before and then have just kind of moved up in the ranks, so they don't have to do that anymore. But it really can be anybody.
And finally, is it typically, because it sounds like you were, for lack of a better term, seduced into this because you like this guy, you know,
Sure.
and it was
Yeah.
you know, boy, I like his attention. But is that the only way it happens, or are people physically grabbed and beaten, and you know, how does this type of thing?
3% are kidnapped into it, which it doesn't seem like very many, but we know 100,000 kids are being trafficked in the U.S. So 3% of that's not small. We know 35% of human trafficking victims are sold into it by family members. So that's not your seduced part, that's more of a forced part, you know. And then 62% are, I would say, seduced into it or convinced by somebody they know.
Blackmail's one way.
Blackmail's one way, threatened, you know, tricked, all of that.
All right.
A 15-year-old girl, alone, confused, sad, addicted, and trafficked on the streets of New York City. She hears sirens in the background, and she knows what that means. It means run. So she and all the other young women out on the track run, but they're not fast enough. The police come, and they chain them all together and take them down to the police station. And she's kind of worried because she's addicted to heroin, and she knows she can't spend that many minutes in the police station, but she goes to the police station, and she goes to court, and they sentence her to Rikers Island prison. And she's thinking, I have to get out of here. I've heard horror stories, and I don't want to be in Rikers Island prison. So she breaks the programming that the trafficker has drilled into her head, and she says, I'm Barbara Amaya. I'm not 21. I'm 15 years old, and I'm from Fairfax, Virginia. Please help me. Please find my family. I just want to go back home. And they do. They say, we found your family. They're coming to pick you up. She feels a sense of relief. They're coming to pick me up. At the same time, I felt so many other emotions. I was scared. I didn't know what I was going to say. I'd been gone for 3 years. They take me to the room where my parents are going to be waiting. I open the door and I step inside, and it's my trafficker in the room, not my parents. And to this day, I don't know how that happened. Not sure. Do you all remember the feeling that you had when you were in middle school, when you were 12 or 13 years old, in 6th, 7th grade? That feeling of excitement, wanting to belong, but yet being very, very, very vulnerable? That's what traffickers prey upon, vulnerability. Whether it's a 12-year-old runaway or a 35-year-old man trying to find money to feed his family, it's vulnerable populations being preyed upon. That's what it's about. It's not complicated. They know how to keep that vicious cycle going. Supply and demand. It's about supply and demand. That's a photo of me, 12-year-old me. The summer I turned 12, I ran away from my Fairfax, Virginia home. And I want to repeat that. The summer I turned 12, I ran away from home, and I went to nearby Washington, D.C. I'd been being abused, and nobody would listen to me, so I ran away from home. In DuPont Circle, a young woman approached me, and she said she wanted to help me, and she understood how I felt. And I went back with her to her apartment, and sadly, her trafficker was there. She had been out like recruiting other runaways. Maybe she'd been one herself one day. One day they took me to the corner of 14th and I Streets, not that far from here, in our nation's capital, and they sold me to a trafficker from New York. And I can remember that day like it was yesterday. My memory's pretty messed up from some of the stuff I've been through, but I can remember that day. I remember the money exchanging hands, and I remember him driving me up to New York, and I remember him taking things up a notch, really. He programmed me, and I use that word on purpose. He programmed my young mind. He knew exactly how to create a commodity out of a human being. He knew how to create a trauma bond. I always get asked, why didn't you just leave? How could that be possible? I bonded with the trafficker. He knew how to create that bond. I never had my first dance. I never had my first innocent kiss. I never went to high school because I was 12 years old when I left home. But I did have an 85-year-old man die on top of me when I was 16 years old, being trafficked in New York. I became heavily addicted to heroin. And heroin saved my life. It numbed me to the existence that I was surviving. I don't want to say I was living because I was merely surviving all those years, over a decade, from 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, over a decade. And then one day I escaped New York. You know, I wish I could say it was really that easy, but it wasn't. It was a lot longer than that, but I don't have a lot of time out here, so one day I escaped New York.
So I want to tell you a story about a young girl I'll refer to as Tasha. She went with her mom and grandmom to town, and when they arrived, mom and grandmom took her to a hotel where an older man was waiting so he could sexually assault her. She was younger than 12. He paid these women, her mom and grandmom, so he could rape her. And this is the man from Homewood, Alabama. Tasha's family members were her traffickers. Traffickers and pimps are one and the same. This is familial trafficking, one of various types of trafficking that happens in the US. Sex trafficking of all kinds is occurring in Delaware now. And the demand for this exists because there are thousands of Johns. Now, anyone who purchases sex with a minor is a pedophile and a child rapist, so we're gonna call that what it is. But for the purpose of today's talk, I'll be discussing adult victims as well. So I'll refer to anyone who buys commercial sex as a John. So here's an example. These two men are Johns. Church pastors from Knoxville, Tennessee. One is a pastor for children aged birth through 5th grade, and he responded to an ad soliciting sex with underage girls. He negotiated a $100 fee for a half an hour of sex with a female minor. The other pastor was also charged for soliciting sex with underage girls, and these men are not alone. There were 300 contacts made in response to that one ad placed online. Ads just like this one on Backpage.com. So I want to show you a recent Delaware Backpage search, and anybody can access this. Many of these are individual ads placed by pimps selling girls and women for sex. Sometimes the girls and boys, because males can be victims as well, are forced to place their own ad. Words like new, petite, or extra small are code words that the pimps use to let the Johns know that they're minors. So when you click on one of these ads, a video clip or a photo like this one will appear. And while this may not be the girl that they're actually buying, it may be a random image used for bait, you get the idea. They are luring men with photos of underage girls. And do you see how brazen the pimps are? New, young girl. So you call the number and you talk to the pimp, who sets up the time, place, service, and cost. And then there's in-call and out-call, depending on whether the pimp travels to the John or the John travels to the pimp. So by now, are you asking yourselves, how do they get away with this? If any of us can pull this up on our computers, why are these traffickers not being caught? And we'll look at that in a bit. But for now, we're going to look at a different type of trafficking victim, an adult. This woman is a probable trafficking victim. She was arrested in Delaware for prostitution. She offered an undercover officer a happy ending at this spa in Kent County. Now, how do we reasonably assume that she's a trafficking victim? She was the one soliciting, right? She was the one offering sex. Nobody was holding a gun to her head. And maybe not at that moment. But part of trafficking is the force, fraud, and coercion that occurs during the grooming phase, which comes after the luring phase, and we'll look at that in a bit too. That money gets turned over at the end of the day to the pimp to meet her quota. A typical quota in a day for a sex trafficking victim is anywhere from $500 to $750 a day. And this is what happened when one young victim did not meet her quota.
And then one night he sent me outside in the area where we live to make $500, which is impossible.
So the earlier article speaks to the arrest of the prostitute and the spa. No mention of the guys buying the sex. And often these guys possess a dark and disturbing mindset, an attitude of perverted entitlement. I paid for you, I can do whatever I want to you, I own your body for the next 30 minutes. So who are these Johns that pay for commercial sex? They are from every walk of life, every race and culture. People you work with and rub shoulders with every day. It may not be that creepy guy lurking in the shadows. It might be your mail carrier, or the person next to you in the pew on a Sunday morning, or your in-law, or your friend, or your child's teacher. Here's a teacher from a Baltimore public charter school. He trafficked a 16-year-old girl. He dated her for 2 months before forcing her to prostitute herself so he could take her money. Police said that the 16-year-old girl was advertising prostitution online and offered to meet an undercover officer at a local hotel. Now, she was recognized as a trafficking victim and not cited for prostitution, in part because there's no legal definition of a child prostitute, but there are prostituted children. But what if she was 22 or 26? So where does this happen? The U.S. has been referred to as a land of opportunity, and it is. But it's also the land of opportunists. So look at all the places identified in the U.S. for probable trafficking via a national hotline. Delaware is a hotbed because of the I-95 corridor. So how does this start? Most prostituted adults begin as trafficked children. They are lured and then trapped. And as they get older and keep having birthdays, there's no viable way of escape. There's nobody to help them. They find themselves as adults now able to take the fall as a perpetrator cited for prostitution, rather than being recognized as the victim and receiving help. So back to the discussion of luring and grooming. A pimp will date a girl, lure her into a relationship. She falls in love with him after he promises her attention, security, a future together, that they're going to be a family. But she has to help out and make some money. So he sets her up on her first date, which includes her being sold to a stranger for sex and then forced to give him the money. Now, she might agree because she wants to please him. But if she refuses, she may be gang raped or beaten and then forced to comply anyway. So she learns quickly to acquiesce because she knows she'll be forced to do it and she may as well save herself the beating. She begins to believe that what has happened to her is her fault. She believes that what has happened to her becomes who she is. She takes it on as her identity, which then determines her behavior. And that principle is true for every single one of us. But her life consists of being bought and sold, exploited for the lust of a stranger and the greed of a pimp. And she is trapped and enslaved and surviving in life without a voice or a choice because of her perpetrator. So how do these perps get away with this? How does this become a $99 billion a year industry and the second largest criminal enterprise behind drug trafficking? Because drugs can be sold and used once, but a human body can be sold over and over, used multiple times a day for years, creating an endless supply of income until she's discarded or dies. One FBI agent suggests that from the time of lure to the time of death, the average lifespan of a victim is 7 years. They die of homicide, suicide, drug overdose, and HIV and AIDS. So how do these perps get away with selling people for sex? Because most of us are not even aware that this is happening, so we don't report it. There's no tips to the hotline or to the police. Our medical field, our educational system, and many state agencies have no idea that this is even happening.